It gives me great pleasure to give my views to the International Club of Portugal at the request of its president and founder, Dr. Manuel Ramalho, on what COVID-19 as a pandemic might mean for international relations as we now see the beginning of the end of the lockdown period and countries in Europe, including those most affected like Italy and Spain, and I hope shortly my own United Kingdom, are emerging from the suppression period by reopening businesses and lifting social distancing requirements. We must, however, on a word of caution, all hope there will be no major second COVID-19 infection wave, as we have to remember there is yet no vaccine or effective antiviral medication, or probably there is still insufficient herd immunity to guarantee this will be the case. I believe a number of issues that have been festering for quite a long time now will now be speeded up, like US resentment towards China for its emerging global economic superpower status and rising influence, particularly in terms of manufacturing jobs having left the USA and relocated to China. Post-pandemic, this will become more problematic as the Trump administration, with its protectionist instincts, will seek increasingly to blame China and particularly for the massive COVID-19 death toll, as President Trump also claims the World Health Organization was too sensitive to Beijing's interests and responsible for a cover-up of the true risk of human transmission back in early January of this year. President Trump dislikes almost all international organizations as part of his America First agenda, and he will vigorously oppose multilateralism during the presidential election. This could be a big problem as countries, including the EU member states, with the USA turning more inwards in a more protectionist fashion, that they all try and reverse globalization and in particular go back to a more dirigiste and state-directed economic paradigm of self-sufficiency economically, particularly with regard to strategic supplies. And in areas like medicines, medical equipment, like ventilators and PPEs, I think this will be a very marked shift. I think the European Union, wary of this, will tighten the takeover rules by foreign companies, particularly Chinese companies getting state aid from acquiring European high-tech ones. The EU will increasingly champion EU-wide businesses in these strategic sectors, which could be vulnerable to disruption from interruption of global supply chains. I also think the hawks in the United States and the populists in the European Union will seek to further undermine the Paris climate change agreements on the carbon neutrality goal for 2050 and try and delay green policies. But I do hope that the more sensible leaders in the European Union, led by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel, will face this threat down, and much of the European Union's multi-annual financial framework will now be devoted to delivering the 2030 targets. I also strongly feel that the early lack of COVID-19 solidarity across the European Union, with countries like Italy and Spain seeking help from less affected countries like Germany, will give rise to more Euroscepticism fueled by populists like Italy's Salvini and his Lega party and Spain's Vox party, who question what the EU is for. In particular, they are very angry during this recent issue, even though health provision is actually vested as a competence in the EU member states, not in the European Union itself. But the resistance by countries like Germany and Holland to any mutualization of debt via Eurobonds or EU fiscal union or further transfers, of course they fear moral hazard, via a special coronavirus Eurobond, is resented, and rightly so, in the southern and Mediterranean countries, and including Portugal. I hope that Chancellor Merkel will now work to prevent such north-south splits and prevent more west-east rifts and splits, given the anger in countries like Poland and Hungary, who have resisted particularly the policies imposed by Brussels on the redistribution of migrants. Orban has now used the COVID-19 crisis as an excuse to rule by decree. I also fear the COVID-19 damage to the global economy will now result in more developing world problems economically and a fresh wave of irregular migration coming across the Mediterranean, trying to enter the European Union, with all the challenges and fuel that this will give in terms of support to nationalist and populist parties across the whole of our continent. However, to conclude and to take a more optimistic note, I take relief that Italy's Salvini's Lega, eager post-COVID-19 to try and blame the European Union, is now down 5% in the opinion polls. Also, as a convinced European, I believe the European Union's project must work for all EU citizens. And I believe that visionary leaders like President Macron and Chancellor Merkel will resist a worsening of the North-South split and do whatever is necessary to avoid another Brexit scenario. And of course, the European Central Bank has been brilliant throughout the crisis. Globally, though, I believe that mistrust for China will be difficult to reverse. And even a President Joe Biden, I believe, fundamentally shares this agenda. I do believe that China, now as the first COVID-19 recoverer globally, must, however, continue to play a vital and engaged role, as we will need collective answers to global problems, which involves effective multilateralism between all the P5 countries, and China is an emerging global superpower in this respect. If a President Joe Biden comes to pass, and I personally would be delighted, he will do whatever he can to reverse the damage of the Trump years in terms of relationship with the European Union. As a medical doctor and former politician, I also happen to believe that climate change, which is now going to be worsened probably by the collapse in the oil price globally, unless mitigated by global working together, will mean all sorts of tropical diseases from dengue to malaria reappearing or appearing for the first time on our continent. Therefore, some of the behavioral and public health changes which COVID-19 necessitated and introduced are likely to become more or less semi-permanent features in our countries and within our economies. But after the economy's big hit this year, we will all have to find novel ways to cope and work around these restrictions. My country, the United Kingdom, will be in a particularly tight spot as it is heading in a no-deal direction at the end of transition in December of this year, 2020. And certainly, I believe there are major potential problems for both the United Kingdom and the European Union's relations with both China and the US, which will also provide increasing challenges to overcome. But if we all work together and find global solutions, I believe we have plenty of grounds to remain optimistic. Thank you.